Hi, I'm Selena Lovett from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Christopher Denise, who is an artist and he's also an author of a wonderful book. Um, and I'm going to let you tell people about your book, Christopher.
Thank you, first of all, for having me. And I'm sorry to say that I have not yet been to Annie's Bookstop, but you're not that far away. So we're going to try and figure something out at some point,
That
probably in
would
the
be
fall.
wonderful.
The publishers like to have me here in the studio as much as possible, but I can't help myself because I love getting to bookshops. I love visiting independent bookstores and I love meeting readers, and the readers that watch these sorts of things. So, and lately when I've been doing that, I've been talking a lot about Night Owl,
Mhm.
which was released in March of 2022. And Night Owl is a particularly special book for me because after so many years of uh, illustrating other people's manuscripts, this was the first book that I both wrote and illustrated. And it is published with Little Brown Publishing, part of the Hachette Book Group. And my editor, of course, was the wonderful, fabulous, and unstoppable Christy Ottaviano.
Hey, could you tell us a little bit more um, about how you got into doing children's books?
Sure, sure. It was sort of a roundabout kind of way. When I'll go back a little bit just to give you an idea of how roundabout it was. Um, I was in high school in New Jersey, and Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, and I thought, okay, that looks like a really fun job. Like Indiana Jones. It's adventurous, it's fun. I had a thing for history. I always had a thing for history. So when I graduated high school, I attended St. Lawrence University, where I was an art history and archaeology major. And that was fantastic. And it was everything that you would expect, ivy color covered buildings, the whole thing. And it was interesting, but I found that I was spending most of my time in studio classes and I was painting these large abstract canvases and just really sort of exploring what it means to be a visual creator. But at a certain point, I felt like I needed more direction. Um, and I didn't even know what an illustrator was. But my brother was studying at Rhode Island School of Design, and I went to visit, and I loved it. I loved the culture. I loved sort of the conversations that were happening. And so I applied to transfer and I was accepted and then began studying illustration once I learned what illustration was. Um, and I really sort of became really engaged with this idea of acting as a visual communicator. Okay. But I still didn't really understand sort of any kind of practical application for it. There was like the advertising world and there were some narrative opportunities to create narrative art at the time in the commercial marketplace. And so I started creating illustrations as a freelancer by my junior year for newspapers, because back then newspapers still used to hire artists. They
Yes.
would say, Chris, we have this article on, 15 things to do this summer, and we want to put it on the magazine section. I'd say, okay, great. And I would create a narrative piece of art. And I did that sort of thing while I was still in school, along with educational textbook work. And I still was really just getting an idea of what children's books were, picture books. Um, but I produced some artwork that sort of fell within that genre a little bit, and people really responded to it, which is nice. As a young artist, you're like, okay, people like this. That's cool. I can make a little bit of money and I can do this. But I was also interested in the really in the problem solving, like sort of how do I tell a story with these images? What kind of details can I include? Where can I take it? And it really encompassed so many different aspects of my interests in terms of research, of course, continuing to refine my visual language through drawing and the application of color. So really, it was just kind of easing into it. Um, and I produced some work that I put on what they used to call a mailer back before the internet, story going way back.
Mhm.
And illustrators used to send out postcards and what they called mailers to art directors and editors. And I had met a friend of mine who worked at a publisher in New York. And I said, "Oh, I'd love to send you some of my work." And she was very gracious, not knowing my work at all, knowing that I was very young. And she said, "Okay." I could tell she was a little nervous about it, but I sent my work in, and this was at Philomel Books in New York City. And I sent in just a packet of reproductions. And she said, "Oh, this is actually quite lovely. Let me share it with the art department." And the art department looked at the work and said, "It's nice, but he needs more time. Come back in a few years." So she took one of those postcards that I made and put it on her wall. And um, just by chance, she was working with my first editor, who became my editor for years, a woman named Patty Gouch, who was renowned in the industry. She introduced me to people. She worked with like Eric Carle, the Hungry Caterpillar, and Ed Young, Lo Po Po, and she worked with Jane Yolen on all of her picture books. Owl Moon, she was the editor. So I had just sort of found this person and she called me up. Well, I found her just because my postcard was on someone's wall. And she was intrigued and she called me up and said, um, "I'd love to meet with you. Um, can you come to New York?" And I said, "Of course." And so I went down to New York with really sort of no plan, just to bring my artwork and chat. And Hattie was of this sort of older school of editors that would work with artists and nurture them and work with writers and nurture them. And I would go down and we would just meet for hours at a time and have sandwiches and talk about picture books and what kind of book I might want to do. And then one day she suggested, after coming back from some meetings, she said, "Why don't you illustrate a version of The Fool of the World and the Flying Ship?" And I said, "Okay, that sounds fun. I don't know what that is. I'll go." So I go over to Books of Wonder in New York and I pick up a copy. And the most recent version of this beautiful Russian folktale was illustrated by Uri Shulevitz. And I look at the book and it's got a Caldicott gold on it. And I think, this is the guy who not only won a gold medal for his version, but also wrote like the book on writing and illustrating picture books called Writing with Pictures. And so I panicked. I tried to get out of it. I thought there's no way I can do this. But Patty calmed me down and I just got to work and started drawing and produced something that I was really proud of at the time. And that's how I started in on picture books. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, so it was really just sort of, it was that combination of luck, but I was also ready. I was ready to work. And so that's the thing. Like, if you want to do this kind of stuff, like, you got to be ready. So, like, that means, practicing, honing your drawing skills, really looking at picture books. And then just sort of continuing to put yourself out there so that you do stumble upon something like that. Yeah.
Okay. So, what do you think draws readers to these kinds of books?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think it's because picture books are in so many ways a really unique art form. Okay. You can have gorgeous writing, like Owl Moon, Jane's manuscript for that. Beautiful, beautifully written manuscript. And her partner on that book, John Schoenherr, incredible artist. I mean, watercolor paintings worthy of, Andrew Wyeth. I mean, just gorgeous, right? And you can have both of those things along with an incredible production team and a great publisher behind it, right? But even then, that is not the writing is not the art form. The pictures are not the art form. The finished book is the art form. But there's one other person involved. That art form does not come to life until it's in the hands of a teacher or a librarian that's reading it or sharing it with a young reader. That's when the art form comes to life. And that's what makes it such an interesting participatory artistic experience. And I think that has always intrigued me. Like, how do I create a manuscript that's going to be compelling? How do I create artwork that develops a parallel emotional narrative to that writing? And then how do I make all of that interesting and challenging and entertaining for that reader that brings it to life? Yeah.
Okay, speaking of entertaining,
Yes.
let's talk about owl. owl. Let's talk about Night Owl.
Okay.
Okay, so what was the inspiration for Night Owl?
Well, and now I'm worried because I feel like all my answers are really long, but it's just, you know, uh, and this is really like the first time I've had to really think about a book because, I publish so many books and then people are like, oh, that's really great. And that's it. But with Night Owl, it was funny. I had a little bit of time in between projects. I mean, I was finishing artwork for illustrators are always working, right? We're always sort of we're like air traffic controllers, big project coming in, another one going out. But I had this little window of time in the my editor that I was working with, Christy Ottaviano, encouraged me along with my agent to try to craft something original. And so I'm working on this book, and I remembered, maybe you remember this. There was a book that I loved from my childhood called Sam and the Firefly. It's going way back. It was a little book, but it's about an owl and a firefly. And I thought that's a really, I don't know, I like the owl character. There was something about it. And so I thought maybe I'll do a book about, I'm playing with this manuscript about an owl that stays up all night, and it's a night owl, right? And so I'm working on it and it's not going anywhere. It was really just like, it was a sleeper. And so I left the studio one Friday afternoon, crestfallen, and I go into the kitchen, and my wife, Anika Aldemoy Denise, who's also a children's book writer, was in there with the kids, and they're making pizzas, and the kids are joking around. They said, oh, what are you working on? I said, well, I'm working on this great book about an owl that stays up all night. And they're like, huh, that's not very funny. That's what owls do. They're nocturnal. And I said, yeah, I guess so. And then Isabel, our middle daughter, asks a question. She asks a magic question. She said, what if, right? She said, what if the owl was a knight? And I got to tell you, like the whole book, like at least, well, probably about 50% of the book dropped into my lap. And I just grabbed my iPad, made a bunch of notes, did a bunch of doodles, and a lot of those ended up directly in the book. And it was just all those things. Again, it was like I was prepared. I've been working, and just by luck, all those things came together. And I thought, that's funny. That is a funny idea. And that's where really the inspiration came from. Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah. Even with the
So,
pizza and everything, I got the pizza in there too.
so what kind of research did you have to do for this book, or did you have to do any?
Well, I had to research owls, obviously,
Hmm.
because young readers are astute. I was
Yes,
up
they
at
are.
some school visits in Maine, and these kids know they're owls. They're
Hmm.
like, is that a screech owl? And so I had to, familiarize myself with the form and the drawing and things like that. And um, a lot of the research for the castles and the armor and things like that, this was not unfamiliar territory for me from my years of work on the Redwall picture books
Mhm.
with my friend Brian Jakes. And so I sort of knew that, but then I had to research really the language of what type of book I wanted to write and what was it going to sound like. And so that got me digging back into picture books and reading them aloud, picture books that I had illustrated for other people, other picture books just in our collection, and really thinking about researching sort of the flavor of the book. Like, for example, there was this section at the beginning of the book originally where I'm developing the characters for Owl's mother and father, right? And I'm trying to get an idea of who the researching what the owls look like for them, but as well like who these characters are and what they're like. And I started thinking about Seinfeld, the Seinfeld show. And I
Yep.
imagined Owl's mother being like, "What do you want to be a knight for? It's dangerous." And his father was like, "We're not knights, we're owls. We fly at night." And so it was like the Costanzas, right? And so I'm researching this stuff and I'm writing all this stuff. And ultimately, none of it made it into the final cut for the book. But what I did, Selena, is I took all that research information and tried to imbue the characters in the visualization with those kinds of attitudes.
Mhm.
So it was a lot of that and a lot of reading aloud. I listen to audiobooks sometimes. Of course, I collect books as well, and I'll read them aloud. I'm a huge Neil Gaiman fan.
Mhm.
So I often will think about how um, he will craft a particular phrase or approach a certain type of story. And obviously, I'm working on a different word count, which is much sort of smaller, more compact text. But I do research those more abstract qualities to allow it to flavor my work, hopefully. Anyway, yeah.
Mhm. Okay. So, what was the biggest challenge that you had in putting out Night Owl? And how did you overcome that challenge?
Sure, sure. I would say that the biggest challenge was that I had to create the text that I was responding to. Okay. So, for example, I did a book with the wonderful Anne Marie Pace, who wrote the Vampirina Ballerina books.
Mm.
And I just adore her writing. There's so much character in it, in her dialogue. And as an illustrator, it was wonderful for me because then I could go in and respond to her writing and say, wow, okay, the character of Groundhog feels like this based upon her writing. So maybe he would look like this. I have the thing that I'm responding to, you know. When I was writing my own manuscript, I had to create that source of inspiration first and then respond to it. And I found that it was an interesting place to be because picture books, in a lot of ways, are like a dance between the author and illustrator. And I
Mhm.
had to do both parts. And I had to figure out when I was going to let the text lead and when I was going to let the images do the heavy lifting and move the story forward.
Hmm. Yeah, that's hard, I would think, because the author only has 32 pages,
That's
right?
right.
In the whole book.
32 or 40, sometimes 48, but usually 32. Yeah. So you do have to really get that word count down. And that's where great editors like Christie are fantastic.
Right. So, what character did you love or hate the most in your book?
Oh, I think it would have to be Owl. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're listening to this and you look at the book, you realize like there are really only, I mean,
Yeah,
mom and dad are in there briefly, and the knights are sort of anonymous. So really you've got Owl and the dragon.
that's true.
And so I thought Owl, because he's really sort of He's sort of a stand-in for all of us, for all of us that were ever a kid and can remember what it feels like to be little in a big world. But then also, he's like all of us that like he's that person that we wanted to be because he's just aspirational and he's just sort of in some ways he finds a way to trust himself and sort of grow into this role. And I think it was Owl, and I think that's why we're continuing on with the books because I think he has more to say and more to learn.
That was my next question. What what can we expect from you in the future?
Well, I do have a very different book um, coming out in let's see, October 10th of 2023, and that book is called Willow and Bunny, and it's written by Anitra Rose Schultz, and it's published by Two Lions. And this is very different. It is such a departure. It's very naturalistic. There's no animals with clothes on. It's about a friendship that develops between this tree and this bunny. There's no face on the tree, but it is this wonderful um I don't want to say sentimental, but it is sentiment driven, and it's about perseverance and endurance and caring. And it's just such a poetic, beautiful manuscript. And when I was developing the art for it, I was drawing heavily on the influence of an artist named Cyrus Wong, who developed all of the concept art for the Bambi films.
Oh, wow.
So it's very loose and very painterly and very atmospheric. So it was a privilege to work on it, and I thoroughly enjoyed the process. And now I'm sort of redirected back into Owl's world, which is also fun because I get to do entirely different things.
So you're both writing and illustrating.
Yes, we have Night Owl companion books that are currently being worked on. Um, and they're developing. There'll be some additional characters that come in. Um, One in particular who's an early bird, and she is fabulous and feisty and noisy.
Okay, that sounds great. So I have questions now about being a writer.
Sure.
Um, and you could also say about being an illustrator too. I mean, what is your favorite part about being a writer?
Oh gosh. I think it's the opportunity to sort of to pursue a creative career that allows you and encourages you to play. And that goes for writing and for illustrating because
Hmm.
you really have to be dedicated in your play because you have to play with ideas to see if they're going to work, to see if they're going to fly. Um, and then once you do land on something, I very much like the world building. When I mentioned all of the dialogue at the beginning of Night Owl that was cut, to me, that's just as important in terms of world building. So I developing the characters, that is just so much fun for me. And also developing the world, in Night Owl, we have so much paper ephemera that appears throughout the book that are little hints about what's foreshadowing and hints about what's going to happen. But you get to create this entire world. And even with the title page of the book, here, I'll grab it. Um, this is so fun for me because this spread right here, all right, our opening spread, right? It says
Hmm.
Night Owl, and Christopher Denise and all that, right? But what this spread is really saying, Selena, is
Hmm.
once upon a time there was a little owl who loved all things nights. He collected night toys. He was fascinated with dragons. He read books on nights. He drew night art, all those things. So it's that kind of thing that I really enjoy.
Okay, that sounds great. So what do you consider the most challenging part of the writing process? And how do you overcome that?
Sure. making time to play,
Aha.
because as a self-employed creative person, you're always thinking, okay, well, I've got to get into production, I've got to keep it going. Excuse me. And you have to be um, very dedicated toward in making sure that you have time for that free thought. That's the most challenging thing. And that means having a rigorous work schedule, a really dedicated work schedule. It does allow for things for, like walks and things like that and some gardening while I'm thinking. But it's really dedicating that time, which sometimes can be the most challenging because, when it gets hard, um, you suddenly think that you can't write another sentence until you clean your refrigerator. It's really important that you clean your refrigerator, and you have to be dedicated. You have to be like, "No, I'm not going to clean the refrigerator right now. I'm just going to keep working on this. I'm going to keep stay the course." So that's
Right.
challenging. Yeah.
Okay. So, what has been your favorite adventure during your entire uh, illustrating and writing career?
Gosh, I mean, Brian, Jakes, and I had some really, really fun adventures whenever we'd get together and go to dinner. I was over in Liverpool and saw him over there, and that was amazing. I'd say generally it's having the opportunity to meet the people that I'm working with. Um, because I'm reading their language, and by the time I get it, it's so beautifully crafted, but then to be able to meet them and talk to them about, you know, where the book came from and also hear them read it. Those types of interactions are really the highlight adventures, and all the things that I think of, it's always an author that I've worked with, listening to them read a story we worked on together or read something else. Um, but certainly back in the days of going and hanging out with Brian Jakes, those were, if talk to anyone who knew Brian, they're going to tell you that's going to be an adventure. You might do a book signing, but the next thing you know, it's, you're out to dinner and then you're at a place and all of a sudden Brian's singing folk songs with a guy that's playing guitar and like, yeah, so you're out. Yeah. Yeah.
So, what piece of advice would you want to share with other artists or other authors?
Oh gosh. I think that the one thing that I realized with Night Owl. Now, Night Owl is the first book that I wrote and illustrated that's published, but it's not the first book that I've written. Okay.
Ah,
I've had a lot of other books that I've tried to write and they just weren't working in the way that I needed them to work. And I think what I realized with the Night Owl, and this is the advice part that I'd share, is that I think that it can be helpful to ask yourself why you're trying to create the thing you're trying to create. So, in some ways, I would encourage or illustrators to ask that question to make sure that they can catch themselves and stop themselves from trying to write the book that they think they should write. They should, like they might be thinking, well, if I do this type of book, people will see me this way. And I had written all these very like heavy, intense, um, poetic manuscripts that were just self-indulgent, really. And people would read it and be like, "You're fun to hang out with. Like you joke around with your kids, you have a great time. Like, where is that person?" And I think that I was trying to be something else in my writing.
mhm.
And I had to sort of get real about what I actually wanted to write. So, sort of really, that would be the advice is sort of like key in on what really brings you joy. Um, and what makes you laugh if you want to write a funny book, or what touches you if you want to write something that's going to affect people differently. But it's really sort of like really having those gut checks about why am I trying to do this particular book? Is it because is it because I admire someone else's work and they have a book like this? Or is it because I want to be seen in a particular way? Really ask those questions and try and get down to the root of it. Because sometimes when you meet resistance, it's just resistance, just saying, this is hard, you got to keep working through it. But sometimes it's a clue, like maybe you might want to shift your focus a little bit.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So are there any groups, clubs, or organizations that you'd recommend to other artists or authors that have helped you in your career?
Certainly, if your viewers are interested in Kidlit, and I assume they are because they're
Mhm.
watching this.
Right.
Um, so, when you're just starting out, the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators is a fantastic resource because you can go to a conference, you can join virtual events, you can do these things and learn a lot of the sort of basics, about the industry. And actually, more than basics, you can learn quite a bit about craft and how the industry works, of course, with agents and publishers and the role of an editor and how you can put your work out there as an illustrator if you're an illustrator. And SCBWI has chapters all over the country, and they're really great for that initial step. And then once you start into it a little bit further, I am part of an organization called Kindling Words, which is for people that have already been in the industry for a bit, and most of them are already published. And that's sort of a deeper dive into craft of writing and craft of illustration. And Kindling Words hosts a yearly retreat and workshop on the East Coast and also one on the West Coast.
Interesting. I hadn't heard about that one.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay. Now I have questions about you as a person.
Oh dear.
What is one thing that most people don't realize about you?
Oh, hmm. Uh, Probably that I've been making books for a long time, maybe. Um, a lot of people say, Night Owl, and it's of course, promoted as my picture book author illustrator debut, which technically
Right.
is true. But I think it's important for people to remember though too. It's not like it wasn't the first picture book I ever worked on. So,
Right.
like that's a really important thing because it's like gotta do it. Like you gotta practice this stuff sometimes for a long time. So I think that it's probably that, that people don't realize I've been making picture books since my first book published in 1990.
Yeah, that's quite a while.
Yeah.
I, and how many do you have out now that you've illustrated?
Oh, probably
Mm,
26 or 7 or so.
it's something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a few. Okay, and this is a tough one. You might not be able to, you might not know the answer to this one, but
All
what
right.
question do you wish interviewers would ask you, and what would your answer be?
Hmm. That is a tough one. Hmm. Um, what- I most of the interviewers, like you've had great questions. I can't even think of anything else. Um, I can think of really tough questions that I wouldn't want to answer. Um, but gosh, I guess it's really about I guess, and we had the opportunity to talk about it today briefly. It's really sort of about the craft of picture book making, because that's immensely interesting for me. And I think even for younger, viewers of
Mhm.
your interviews, to me, it's just fascinating how other people approach that, how other people approach manuscript, how other people approach storytelling. Um, and I think it's sort of that whole idea of thinking about, asking about, thinking the our role as a visual communicator, and why it's important to tell stories.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's kind of lofty, which is
Yeah.
probably good. I don't get asked that often. I'd be
And what
like,
would your answer be?
because books are good. I don't. Again, it would probably be like another 45-minute answer for your question.
Okay, I think we'll save that for another interview. Okay. Okay. Now, what is or are your passions when you're not writing or illustrating? And how do you make time to do the things that you love?
Lately, it's become difficult to make that time. When our girls were younger, we dedicated a lot of time um, to them, spending time with them, reading with them, hanging out, and I don't regret 1 second of that. That was a place of privilege to be able to do that. I mean, we definitely made sacrifices in our careers to do that and didn't do fancy vacations or anything else like that. But these days, when I do have a little bit of time, I do like to paint. I like landscape painting. Um, we are both really enthralled with the idea of growing a lot of our own food and cooking as well. So you kind of have to make time for that because,
Yeah.
who doesn't love, great lettuce that you just chop out of the garden and bring in. Um, but it is a challenge. It's a challenge, particularly in this time frame, and it's a wonderful challenge to have, because a lot of people are excited about the next Night Owl and what's going to happen next with the characters. So it's a balancing. I'm probably doing a fraction of the landscape painting that I was doing years ago, but there'll be a time for it again. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Okay. So what does your studio space look like? When you're writing, and what do you need to have with you?
Sure. Um, I did build a studio a number about 10 years ago, and I try to keep it, though it's quite messy right now, um, sort of clean and open as possible,
Hmm.
with several work surfaces that I can sort of go from place to place. Um, and I try to keep it, as I keep a book that I'm working on the wall so I can always see it. But then I really try to sort of reduce the clutter and distractions. I do have a few instruments around, but I'm pretty disciplined about saying, okay, now is not the time to learn another song. But yeah, it's pretty, I don't want to say Spartan, but it's almost, I like simple and open.
Hmm.
That gives me a nice place to think and quiet.
Okay. Do you have to have any food or drink with you when you're
Lots,
working?
yeah, lots of really good espresso.
Ah,
Yeah. Yeah.
keeps you awake.
Keeps me awake. I love it. And then, I suppose if I'm going into an evening session, then maybe a really nice glass of French red would be fabulous for editing.
Do you find editing the hardest thing to do?
Not if I have time away from it.
Ah.
So if I write something and I could afford to not look at it for a week or two, and then I can come back to it, um, and have the opportunity to read it aloud and record myself reading it aloud, then I can hear it, and then editing is easier.
Hmm. Do you
Yeah.
have other people work with you look at it and give you um give you some ideas for it?
I'm careful about that because I think then too many people in there can, at least for me, I know other people that are in writing groups, for example,
Hmm.
they love it. They love critique groups. They love the feedback and they thrive in that environment. For me,
Right.
I like to have one or two readers. Usually one of them is my editor.
Hmm.
Sometimes my reader is Anika, but sometimes it is not. She'll read stuff only sort of later on. Um, and then sometimes I worked with Jamie Michalik. She was one of my first readers on Night Owl as well. She's also a writer and Joe and Sparky books and all that sort of picture book writer. And yeah. So she read it and her feedback was she had worked as an editor at Candlewick Press. So her feedback was sort of more structural.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, just a few readers here and there. Artwork I don't show a lot because my sketches are so all over the place. They're so messy.
Mm.
Nobody can really tell what they are. Um, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So
Okay. So, when you're working, do you listen to music or do you like silence? And if music, what kind of music?
when I'm drawing, it's funny. There's a weird distinction here. When I'm drawing, crafting the sort of the lights and darks of the piece and the proportions of the characters and all this sort of thing, I can't listen to anything.
Hmm.
Once I have that foundation in place and I'm painting, then it's a lot of Bach cello concertos, the Pablo Casals versions, a lot of ambient music, um, things that are just there that are sort of churning away in the background.
Hmm. Okay. Um, Interesting. Now, writers often have furry or feathered or otherwise non-human companions to help them or hinder them with their work. And do you have any, and do they help or hinder you?
Well, we do have a large tabby cat in the house, and he and I have an interesting relationship. Sometimes we adore each other, sometimes we're at odds. And he doesn't come out here, but he does provide comic relief when I go in for lunch and dinner.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, exactly. Let's keep it that way. That's good. We're good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't actually imagine a cat coming into a studio and saying, "Oh, that looks really nice," and puts his paw
It happens
on
all
the
the
paint.
time. And I there's just something about um, Charlie's energy, that's the cat, that
Uh,
we just don't we he's just not the right one. There was a cat when I was painting my first book, a neighborhood cat that would come over and scratch at my door, and I would open my apartment door and she would walk right in. She was this beautiful white Siamese mix, and she would go over to my table and look at me till I sat down at my painting table, and I would sit down and start painting, and she would jump up on my lap and sit there for hours. And then she'd be ready to go and go to the door, and she would come back day after day.
oh wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe the lights were warm or something. Yeah.
Maybe your lap was warm.
Yeah. There you go. There you go.
Okay, now I have two more questions for you.
Okay.
Um, One, where can people find your work aside from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester?
That's right.
And I have to put a plug for Annie's. You can get Night Owl at and Christopher's other work at Annie's if you call us at 508-796-5613, or you can email us at orders@anniesbooksworcester.com. And where else can people find your work?
I mean, Night Owl is pretty much all over the place. But I would encourage your viewers to support your local independents because they're the ones who are championing books. They're the ones who are going through all the lists. I mean, you have booksellers that are working at larger chains that are very dedicated and read through. But there's nothing like developing a relationship with your local independent bookstore so that they can really help curate a list and bring books of note to your attention. Um, but pretty much Night Owl is pretty widely available now, so that's wonderful. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, they shouldn't really have a problem finding it. Yeah.
Okay. And last question, how can we follow your work and share your awesomeness?
Um, certainly, I try to limit my time on social media. Um, I do a thing where I develop a bunch of posts and then I sort of put them around, and usually it's process posts that I do on Instagram. So if you just look up Christopher Denise on Instagram, you'll find me. And a lot of those posts just feed over to Facebook for a professional page. Again, if you just look up Christopher Denise Illustrator, you'll find me. And then occasionally I'll post something that is maybe a little bit longer form or one that idea that I had that thought would make a better blog post if any people read blogs anymore. Um, there is christopherdenice.blogspot.com. Yeah, but it's mostly Instagram. Mostly it's so many illustrators on Instagram. So it's fun for us to share, our work and see what, our colleagues are working on and um, stay in touch that way.
Mhm. And you also have a web page, right?
Yes, I do have a web page. It's pretty basic. It'll give you an overview and a couple images from each book. And there are some links in there for, if you wanted to purchase the book. Um, I think one of them is to Indie Next so that you put in your information, you find the closest independent bookstore, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, it's been very nice speaking with you today, and perhaps you will come in the fall to Annie's. Okay.
I have to. I got to get over there. I mean, it's maybe what 40 minutes away. So certainly now, and we'll be sure to let your viewers know that once I do get over there, that you'll have some signed books in stock,
Great.
and we'll kind of go from there. But I'll give you a buzz and let you know when I'm heading out that way.
That sounds wonderful. Christopher Denise, it's been very nice having you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it was great.